Burr? Since when are you a Democratic Republican?
Since being one put me on the up and up again.
No one knows who you are or what you do.
They don't need to know me.
So my name is Vanessa. I'm studying a Bachelor of Arts. I'm in my third year, and what's the last bit?
Political affiliation.
Yeah, I'm a member of Student Unity.
And when did you join Student Unity?
I joined Student Unity in, I believe it was late February.
And why did you join?
I think a lot of my friends are in Student Unity, and I really do agree with a lot of the politics that they have.
So you made a conscious choice to join a right-wing faction of the Labour Party rather than a left-wing faction?
That's correct, yes.
Cool.
Okay, cool. So can you tell us why you're running for board, but you're not allowed to say it's because you like or love or enjoy the union?
I've made most of my friends through the union, and I think I've just had like a lot of really positive experiences with the union in general. It's kind of just, where I want to be at the moment.
Okay, that sounds a lot like you like or enjoy the union. So why else are you running for union?
Well, I think I have the experience, and I think I'm extremely capable enough to be able to take on a role like this. Like, as I said, I have been involved for more than 3 years now. And yeah, is that sort of what you were after?
Sure. Controversy that resolved itself today was the conflict over the registration status of the Evangelical Union, which is based upon the requirement that their members make faith-based declarations.
Yep.
Do you support the actions of the board? What's your stance on such declarations? And what's the action you would have taken had you been on board this year?
Yep. So I don't suppose I would really know what I would have done because I wasn't in the position. But I think from my perspective, if the board does try to implement regulations over a certain club or society, I believe that they should be implemented consistently across the board. So in this instance, I feel, the union has had a look at the different options laid before them and has made a decision based on that. And I feel like that's the best that they could have done, I suppose. Like, in my perspective, I personally believe that it didn't really bother anyone to allow faith-based membership because other societies do it as well. So yeah, I think my point in it would be consistency.
So does that mean that you're consistently for things like faith-based declarations or consistently against them?
I think it would depend. I would take it from a case-by-case perspective. So for something like the Evangelical Union, if it is allowed to another religion, I feel it's somewhat unfair to not apply that rule to someone else.
On the facts, though, it wasn't allowed for any society. Essentially, the USU's made an exemption. So do you think that exemption should apply to other groups on campus which might want to autonomously organise, like say the Women's Review Society?
I think identity, it's a bit of a difficult one. I feel identity politics is quite different to say religious identity politics, in the sense that I feel if you're not specifically, it's not something that you're specifically bound by your personal ideology, then it's not something that should be consistently implemented throughout a greater framework through clubs and societies. So in my perspective, I think what the board did in terms of stamping it out at the beginning probably wasn't the wisest decision. So I think continued consultation with students is more of a consistent way to be able to handle situations like these. So in your perspective, I really do feel for example, Women's Review and stuff should be autonomous, but I feel that sort of identity-based thinking is very different to proclaiming your faith to a certain religion.
So to clarify, you'd allow any gender or sexuality-based requirements to exist, but not allow any religious clubs to require their members to be of a certain faith?
So I think in terms of gender and sexuality, I personally pertain it to be unquestionable. I don't feel that religious societies should be bound by a certain, I suppose, I personally think, I don't know, it's really difficult. I think Sorry, could you rephrase the question?
Would you allow an autonomous women's review society to require its members to be non-cis male identifying? But because it's less inherent than a religious identity, you wouldn't allow the evangelical union to have such, or to require such declarations?
I don't think I wouldn't allow it. I suppose, like, it'd be... because we have a lot of experience in terms of, like, dealing with issues of gender and sexuality, so they're discourses that are sort of already built, I suppose. So I think it's predominantly about student consultation and sort of learning from the mistakes, I suppose, that perhaps weren't the best decisions made by the board. And I think in that perspective, like, I personally agree that, like, as I said before, there shouldn't be an issue with declaring faith-based membership, because, like, essentially it's been, like, the appropriate avenues have been consulted with, and I feel that's the outcome that's come about. So, like, predominantly we are a student-run organisation, and we're an organisation that speaks for students. So, you know, I don't know.
So just to get your absolute answer.
Yeah.
If you were on the student board elected last year, you would have not voted for the policy that was passed today.
No, like, I would have allowed faith-based membership.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why do you clarify the difference between religion and gender?
I just think it's important to note, because I think a lot of people make the distinction between, like, if the Women's Review Society can have autonomy, why can't faith-based religions? So I think, like, it's important to clarify that there is an existing discourse surrounding gender and sexuality, and that's why it's, like, sort of more of a pre-established, preambled sort of point.
Sure. Well, look, to move on to a slightly separate topic area, do you think that the board should be able to discuss issues such as executive salaries in camera?
No, I do not.
Why is that?
Because the executive salaries are directly relating to students who are on the executive, and therefore should be available to students who elect those students up to board.
Do you think there's a distinction between publishing the salaries after the fact and allowing discussion of sensitive commercial information to flow freely at the board meetings while they're in camera?
I believe if it directly pertains to how much executive members are getting paid, and how that affects whether or not, like, students vote for them, whether they believe that they can complete their jobs sufficiently, then I believe that should be published.
So does that mean, would you have anything in camera?
The only thing I think should be in camera is details relating to staff.
To staff?
To staff, yes.
But that would be executive salaries?
No, like, staff members employed by the union, not like student directors, board directors.
So the executive would be like the CEO
salary.
Right,
CEO
right.
salary.
Okay. In that case, like, I suppose it's still somewhat... Yeah, I still keep to my first point. I think, like, if... I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. I thought you meant the board executive.
It's a valuable answer anyway. So
Yeah.
you would discuss the salaries of all board members, be they the president, secretary, not in camera.
Yeah.
You would go in camera to discuss, like, I guess to call them the adult members of staff for the USU.
Yeah.
Just kind of.
Yeah.
I
think
so
as well.
What's the difference?
Yeah, I think as well it depends on whether or not they give their consent to be on the record about those things, because I think those things in particular, like, we have a responsibility to also, like, look after the staff that are employed by the union. So
Cool. I imagine basically no one would give their consent. So does that mean that you'll effectively run all of it in camera?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're currently Women of Colour Officer for the SRC. How would you balance your duties as Women of Colour Officer and Board Director if you were elected?
Yep. So I think for my personal, I think in my perspective, in terms of, like, whether or not I balance my duties, I think is very much dependent on, like, my study load. So I do intend to reduce my study load a bit in order to deal with the extra sort of stresses of that. At the moment I'm doing 3 subjects, so I'd either drop down to, like, 1 or 2, I think, in order to, like, sort of keep up with all the demands, and I don't actually have a job outside of uni either, so sort of, yeah.
There were some concerns raised earlier this year that you weren't adequately fulfilling a role. I mean, they were published in our newspaper.
Yeah.
Do you have any response to that as to how you would manage to adequately fulfill the role of the board director?
So I think one of the main concerns was that I was not attending executive elections, meetings. Sorry. So I was not attending executive meetings, but that was because I actually didn't have the notices for them. But another story altogether. But after I had been notified of what I had failed in my duties to do, I amended my behaviour to ensure that I attended executive meetings after that and sent apologies for the ones that I couldn't attend.
You mentioned something about not receiving notice. Is there anything that I guess you'd want to say on the record?
Yeah. I think the main thing is that the Women of Colour Collective and the Women's Collective have a different Gmail, and the notices don't get sent to the Women of Colour Collective Gmail. Yeah.
There's also been concerns raised about your role in Shades as publicity officer.
Mm-hmm.
Shades recently held a general meeting in which they attempted to dissolve your position.
Yeah.
And you did not attend. It's unclear at present whether that position was actually dissolved. But I see on your CV you submitted to the USU that you do list yourself as the present publicity officer for Shades.
That's correct.
Do you want to speak to that controversy at all?
Yep.
Shades?
So the position has not yet been dissolved because they have not put it through CNS yet. And a lot of other executive positions were also dissolved at the same time. So I think it was everything after treasurer was dissolved, and everyone's a general secretary now. But that's until CNS manages to process those documents. So at the moment I'm still currently on the exec as publicity officer. We had the 7 Deadly Sins party the other night, and I was one of the main Shades people that were there. So in terms of not attending enough events and things like that, I do make it to what I can, and in terms of not attending the AGM, I just couldn't make it. Yeah.
When you say what I can, what is preventing you from attending these meetings?
Yeah. So I live quite far away, and also my parents are really strict, so I can't go out a lot at night time, and Shades events are always at night.
Yeah.
So so that's a big thing, but that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Are Shades meetings normally at night time?
They're normally at 6 or 8, and I normally have to be home by 7.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Because I suppose the concern from someone looking at that, that list of
definitely.
facts is how will you add another, arguably larger position to all of these positions you already hold?
Yeah, definitely. I think as well specifically, most of my terms that the positions that I hold will be finishing up this year anyway.
Okay.
So it is going to clear up a lot. So it should be fun.
Do you see any ethical problems with the USU's use of volunteer labour in the V team? I understand that you would identify as a left-wing / progressive candidate.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think a corporation using volunteer labour is unethical, or how does that sit with your pro-labour principles?
Yeah. I think personally, my experience with the V team has been nothing but positive. I think in terms of, I think this discussion was had, 2014 O Week as well, just, surrounding, whether or not V-teamers were replacing the work of paid access people. And I think in this particular case, I think it's not necessarily about doing, it's not necessarily about taking, paid work away. It's about, I think the experience for certain students, because a lot of students don't actually get to, volunteer at, or aren't comfortable volunteering outside campus. So this is a good foray for them to start volunteering on campus. In terms of their involvement, they're not particularly doing, major tasks. It's normally just, manning the V-team stall or, helping out with the breakfast bar. They're not highly labour-intensive jobs for it to be considered replacing paid work.
But the USU would pay people if they didn't volunteer.
I suppose so, but in saying that, the V team provides an invaluable volunteer experience for students who do not like volunteering off campus or who aren't comfortable volunteering off campus.
When you say students aren't comfortable volunteering off campus, is it fair to characterise what the V team does as the equivalent of like working in a soup kitchen. Like one seems to serve quite a social justice interest, whereas the other is really just providing staff for a corporation.
That's also fair, but I think as well it neglects the point that the V team also does various charity events outside of campus as well. So it's not like it's mainly centered around doing festivals and like taking away paid work. It's also centered around going out there volunteering for things like Daffodil Day, or like going out there doing like pancakes for Parkinson's and stuff like that. Like it's not just centered upon like festivals and fun stuff, but there is the fun stuff there for those who want to volunteer for it.
Would you reform the V team to be only charitable volunteer at work?
I think there definitely needs to be a greater focus on charity work, but I think as well, like there is a general, like my general issue with the V team as well is that it's not particularly student run. So I do believe that there should be like a sort of CNS model implemented within the V team to include like a president, a vice president, a secretary, a treasurer, just to ensure that there's sort of more of a like a student perspective in terms of like what ideas and what events are brought forward to the table that the V team are involved in. Because I think at the moment there's definitely that lack, and it's very much like the USU being like, okay, we have this event, you can volunteer for it. Whereas I think if it was students bringing the ideas to the table, it would be a different story.
And just one final question on that point. Why is the V team experience of manning a desk more valuable if it's unpaid?
Sorry, mind blank.
So why is it better for you to man a desk as an unpaid volunteer than an employee? Why is it a more valuable experience?
Like in the sense of like manning the stall, like the V team stall?
Yeah.
I mean, performing any of the work that the V team
Yeah.
do.
Well, I think like things like specifically like manning a V team stall, for example, like that's something that specifically is a part of the V team. So they're just like volunteers talking to other students. It's like any club or society. Like if you have like, for example, like I don't know, like Chuck Sock. You have Chuck Sock executive talking to potential new members about joining Chuck Sock. It's like the same thing for the V team. You have V team members talking at the V team stall to potential new volunteers. Like that sort of role isn't something that I think is like regularly recognised as a paid role.
Cool. So to switch back to kind of election politics,
Yep.
let's assume that you weren't on the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
Who would you put 1 to 3?
Yep. So first up, I'd probably put Cam Hawkins, just because I think a lot of the ideas that Cam has in terms of his policies sort of resonate a lot with mine. So I think he's planning to expand like rewards program, and that's something that I really wanted to do as well. And then probably second, I'd probably go Courtney Thompson, just because I really admire her feminist politics, and yeah, I think a lot of her policy ideas are really sound. And third, probably Esther Shim, maybe? Yeah, I think her policies focus a lot on like the campus experience and student life, and that's sort of the perspective that I want to take as well with my campaign.
Will you be directing your preferences to those candidates?
No.
Is that because of your involvement in student unity?
No, I just don't know anything about preferences, so it would be unwise for me to like start dealing with it.
Do you anticipate, based on your significant involvement in some previous elections, that you will be preferencing Labor candidates?
I don't personally want to. I don't think I will. Yeah.
So what would, if they're your clear preferences for board members,
Mhm.
what would determine your preference flow, if not who you think is a good board member?
What would deter? Okay. I think primarily I think it would be driven by what the best preference deal would be. I think. I don't think it should be dependent on political affiliations.
So your metric is how many votes they can get you by putting your name on their how to vote.
Yeah, and also like whether or not I loosely agree with them in terms of their politics.
Do you think that's the best strategy for achieving an optimal board composition?
I don't know much about preferences, but I'm not sure like how much they come into play in terms of like determining the makeup of the board. So
almost every year preference flows will be determinative. So I guess with that in mind, would you preference candidates that are better but less advantageous to your campaign, or more advantageous to your campaign but less consonant with your political views?
Yeah. I think I'd be open to like all options at this stage. Like I can't really say at this stage what I think I would do because I haven't seen everyone in action and stuff, and I haven't been able to look at everyone's policies at depth at this stage either.
Cool. Who would you preference if you were voting?
Yeah.
Who would be last on your ballot paper?
This is so terrible, but like if I had to pick, I'd probably say Dom, just because I don't really agree with any of his policies or his political affiliation. But yeah.
Okay.
Similarly, who do you think's been the most effective board member who was elected last year?
Last year? I would probably say, I think, probably, like, in my perspective, I think Atia, just because I really think, like, in terms of, like, getting the ethnocultural space up and going, that's something that, like, we've been waiting for a long time, like, since Baby D'Souza. So, like, to see that sort of finally in the works and happening is, like, pretty cool.
Is that a decision also based on the fact that you're both from Unity?
No, like, I genuinely, like, am excited about the ethnocultural space.
So if Atia runs for president, will you vote for her?
If she provides a good case or brief, and I'm convinced by, because I really, at the end of the day, I would like to vote on a presidential candidate based on merit. So my vote is up for grabs at this stage, like.
So you would not listen to, I understand that Student Unity is not a binding caucus,
No.
but you would not you would not be swayed by the wants of your faction in terms of your executive vote.
So I want essentially to see all the briefs and sort of have a read of everything and make sure that the best representative is president.
Okay.
So, a lot of the candidates we've been speaking to today have suggested they may vote for Michael Rees.
Mm-hmm.
So if it were a contest between Atia and Michael, who would you pick?
I don't think I could really say. Like, I really have to look at both briefs. Like, I know Michael has a lot more experience in terms of the union itself. So that would definitely be a determining factor in what I decide in the end. But I think, like, at the end of the day, like, if they're able to convince me to vote for them, then I'm happy to do that.
Cool. And what is the best policy that you feel has been developed by the board over the past year? Maybe if we don't include the ethnocultural space in this.
Yeah, I was literally just going to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the implementing the what's it called? Sorry, my brain's blanked for a minute. It's the low SES equity access cards.
Yeah.
I just think it's something that the union's sort of been promising for a long time, and it's really great to see it, like, actually starting to happen.
If you're elected to board, you will be bound by fiduciary duties to the corporation. Would you ever breach those fiduciary duties if you believed it to be in the best interests of the students?
No.
Why would that be?
Because I think primarily speaking, like, in terms of separating, like, particular roles, I think whichever role that you're completing at the time deserves what you've promised to do at the beginning of the role. And so that's probably why I just wouldn't, like, it's part of my responsibility not to, if I do get elected.
So you promised a Halal snack pack festival. I suppose my main question is, how does that differ from International Day?
So I just imagine it to be like a bunch of stalls where you can sample, like, different halal snack packs. Like, it would just be like Halal Snack Pack Appreciation Society Heaven.
Is there a reason why you're using the term Halal snack pack and not meat box?
I think just because there's, like, a general culture that's sort of generated behind it, and, like, a lot of people recognize the term now. But yeah, like, I think personally, like, I just think it would be a really cool thing to happen, and I think a lot of people on campus would be really excited to see it happen also, because it is quite different to, like, International Student Week, where it's kind of like an array of different cultures, but this is sort of more targeted and specific.
I suppose my question is, how likely do you think it is that this policy gets up?
Like, probably not very likely, but I thought, like, it'd be good to, like, put a bit of me into my policy. And I think that's something that, like, you know, if I do get on board and I can do it, I will do it.
Okay. So you're running on a policy that you don't think will necessarily.
I think generally, in order for something to happen through the USU, it needs to be a shared interest of the board. So if, like, the other board directors don't want a halal snack pack, like, festival, then that's not something that I'll be able to do. But, you know, it's something that I'll probably try to advocate for because I want to see it happen.
Cool.
Similarly, if I read from your statement from Facebook, you said you want bigger and better parties that I promise you'll actually want to come to with party reviews so the USU can keep making them better.
Yeah.
Policy platforms on parties have previously been criticised as vacuous, vague, and a bit tired.
Rarely ever fulfilled.
And rarely fulfilled. You don't mention specific things in this policy. Why does that criticism not apply to you?
I think the specific thing that I've mentioned in that policy point is a party review. So specifically speaking, it's not promising that the parties will particularly, like, be instantaneously better, but it's promising that there will be a process and a review into the fact that at the moment there's no event quotas in place, there's kind of no ticketing system in place either, and we're not really looking at what other universities are doing to make their parties sort of much more attendable. So I think really looking into sort of like the operations office, which is apparently called the Rock office, and how they sort of plan events and sort of structure their events, because they kind of just sort of plan the event and then sort of turn up on the night and they're like, oh, I wonder how this will go. Whereas, like, you know, I think if you implement something like, for example, ticketing, like, you sort of know, oh, like, it's Monday, we've only sold 20 tickets, but we need to sell like 100, and then they can get a stall out on Eastern Avenue and start selling more tickets, if that makes sense. But I think personally for me, it's sort of more of a promise to make it better, not instantaneously, but sort of a process in which we can sort of look toward making the party planning and, like, sort of the ideas behind the parties a bit more efficient and a bit more, like, relevant to students.
Are these tickets free for students? Because a lot of the parties the USU runs are free parties for access holders.
Yeah.
Is it just a symbolic ticket, or
It could be like a,
exchange
like,
of funds?
yeah, I think that's something to definitely look into, like, whether or not it's paid or whether or not it's, like, just a free symbolic ticket. But that's something that, like, you know, obviously you'd have to look more into once you're elected onto board.
What is one party inefficiency that you'd strip away?
I think probably, like, overbooking event, like, anticipating more people than would actually attend a party, which I think is, like, a huge problem, because, like, a lot of the USU parties that I've attended have, like, really bad numbers, and then everyone's kind of sitting around being like, oh, this isn't really fun, don't really want to be here, and then that's not sort of the idea that we want to push with USU parties. Like, we want to push the idea that it's vibrant, that it's fun, and that, like, lots of people attend and stuff.
Cool. Well, we've run out of time.
Cool.
So I guess that's it. Thank you very much for coming in.
No worries.
Thank you.
Thank you for having
Best of
me.
luck with your campaign.
Thank you.
Have fun.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks.
Burr, since when are you a Democratic Republican?
Since being one put me on the up and up again.
No one knows who you are or what you do.
They don't need to know me.